My name is Nicole Adams, and for my final presentation for pairing food and wine, my topic is how sparkling wines are produced. To introduce the topic of sparkling wines, I think it's important to start with knowing that sparkling wines can come from anywhere around the world. It's not just Prosecco from Italy or Champagne from France. Now, countries all across the world, including the United States, New Zealand, Spain, and pretty much everywhere, are making sparkling wines. Sparkling wines can have a variety of body styles. What goes into the body style is the type of grape used, the fermentation method, and the growing region where the grapes were grown. As far as body styles, the acidity levels are highly impacted by the climate of where the grapes are grown. So, a more northern climate will have a higher acidity level. As far as the sweetness levels, they also vary in wines. There is a large range of how sweet a sparkling wine can be, ranging from a very dry sparkling wine to a very sweet sparkling wine, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Another thing that there's variety with sparkling wines is effervescence, something that is very kind of a trademark of sparkling wines is the effervescence levels. And this means it's the effect to which foods the wine will pair best with. Effervescence helps cleanse and neutralize the palate, making sparkling wines very refreshing. And also, the body style affects what wines will pair well with what foods there are to be eaten. Because there's so much to consider, sparkling wines can be a very complex topic. Also, sparkling wines are most commonly associated with celebratory events and elegance. Some great examples are weddings, whenever somebody is congratulating someone or celebrating something, romance and love, and also these sparkling wines have a variety of how sparkling they are. So there are slightly sparkling wines, semi-sparkling wines, and full sparkling wines. Again, when these are associated with things like weddings, this is also associated with things that are expensive. For example, it's very common for people to think of a sparkling wine like champagne with caviar, but the truth of the matter is that sparkling wines are a vast variety that can pair well with every part of the meal from the appetizer all the way to the dessert. The bubbles are the signature of any sparkling wine. That's what makes them so special and unique. So how do we create these bubbles in these wines? Well, there is a double fermentation process in most cases to make the bubbles in the sparkling wine. And during a double fermentation process, which is most commonly used, basically how it works is that the bubbles are the products of the carbon dioxide, or CO2, when fermentation occurs under pressure. So, because there's so much pressure going on in the bottle or the tank or whatever is being used, that CO2 gets trapped in that pressure and it forms the bubbles that we love so much. So, second fermentation happens when sugar and yeast are added to a still-based wine, but we'll get more into that when we talk about the traditional methods of making sparkling wines. There is an exception that we'll also get into a little bit later that does not require a second fermentation process. Also, something to know about bubbles is a good rule of thumb is that the smaller the bubbles, the better quality the sparkling wine will be. One of the most common methods of producing sparkling wine and one of the most highly regarded processes of making sparkling wine is called the traditional method, or the méthode champenoise. This is because this is the method that is used to create champagne. So this traditional method produces the highest quality sparkling wines, which also usually means that these are more expensive bottles of sparkling wines. So the steps that go into this process are first taking still wine that has already been fermented and is already fine wine as it is, and then yeast and sugar are added to the still wine. Inside this bottle, the yeast ferments the sugar into alcohol, which gives off CO2. So this is all happening inside of wine bottles. Then the next thing that happens is that these age a little bit, and while these are aging, something called lees happens. And basically lees are the dead yeast that forms during aging. This is good because it adds richness and texture to wine, but at the same time, it's important that we don't keep all of the lees in the wine because it forms a sediment that we don't really necessarily need or want in the bottle. So the next process is called riddling, and this is kind of how we address the lees that are in the sparkling wine. Riddling is gradually turning the bottles at steep angles to get the lees into the neck of the bottle. This can be kind of a complicated process, and in the olden days it used to be done by hand and could take up to 6 weeks. But now, a mechanism called the gyropallet compiles the process over just 3 days. So we've really found a way to mechanize and speed up this process. What happens after the lees are, put into the neck of the bottle are that disgorging happens. And disgorging is essentially removing the lees. And what happens in this process is that the bottle neck is frozen and it frees the lees and sediment with the neck of the bottle. So while this has all been happening, there's been a temporary or fake bottle cap on the bottle. That is removed, and then this piece of ice that has the lees kind of shoots out, which removes the lees and leaves the sparkling wine behind. This can be a very tricky, finicky process, and so it takes a lot of skill to be done. A lot of the times it used to be done by hand, and it could be kind of dangerous for this ice to be shooting out. So it's kind of an art and a skill, but now this is done mechanically to save time and to make things easier on people. The next step is dosage. Dosage is a blend of sugar and wine that is added into the wine for sweetness. So the dosage determines how sweet the sparkling wine will be. The next thing is that sometimes these bottles are aged for a short or very long period of time, sometimes up to decades. So this method is the most common for the Champagne region. This is how champagne is produced, and this is where it gets the fancier method name. Some sparkling wines are required to use this method also in other countries. Some wines in France and Luxembourg, as well as the famous sparkling wine Cava in Spain. Also, a few wines in Italy use this process. It is a very common method of producing sparkling wine. Another method of producing sparkling wines that is very common is called the Charmat or tank method. So basically, the main differences between the traditional method and the tank method are that the second fermentation in this method takes place in a pressurized tank, often a steel tank, not the bottle. Also, another difference is that after the sugar and yeast are added, oftentimes these are chilled to stop the fermentation. And then, after the whole process is done, the sparkling wines are filtered and bottled under pressure. So instead of creating the sparkling wines within the bottles themselves, they're created in a tank and then bottled while being pressurized. It's a very interesting process, and because of how this process works, it really emphasizes fruity and aromatic flavors. It doesn't mask them or cover them up. It really is a good way to bring them out, especially with them being in a tank and not being affected by other things like wood or other externalities. So because of this liking to fruity and aromatic flavors, Prosecco is made using this method. Prosecco was starting to be produced in Italy in the 1960s and 70s. Prosecco is quintessentially Italian, and the grape that's used to make Prosecco is called Glera. It is delicate and aromatic, so it is perfect to be used for this method. Another famous sparkling wine that's used this method is used for to make is called Lambrusco. A very unique and interesting method of making sparkling wine is called the ancestral method. What makes this process unique is that the wine is bottled before the first fermentation process is complete. So about halfway through fermentation, it is paused, and then through various steps that are similar to the previous methods, the wine is bottled, and the sugar actually builds pressure and creates bubbles in the bottle. And so what's interesting is that this is praised for a natural winemaking technique. Remember when I was talking about one process not having a second fermentation? Well, this is kind of the ancestral method. So some might say that there is a second fermentation method that's going on when it's in the bottle, but some might say it's just a continuation of the first fermentation. So, what's also interesting about this is that the sugar plays a very interesting role. If there's too much sugar added to the bottle and then closed, the bottle will explode from too much pressure. So there's a very delicate balance between how much sugar to add into the wine while it continues fermenting. Because of this, a lot of people don't put too much sugar into these bottles of sparkling wine. So the ancestral method wines often have softer bubbles and some residual sugar and sediment in them, because whereas in this process there isn't a method to take the sediment or take the lees out of the bottle. This also sometimes produces a more cloudy looking sparkling wine. However, this is a fairly natural technique. Nothing is added like in other methods. It's just the wine naturally being left to create itself. So a lot of organic or, younger natural wineries tend to lean towards this ancestral method. Another method of producing sparkling wines that almost isn't worth mentioning is called the carbonation method, and this is because this method produces sparkling wines that are extremely low quality. This wine is carbonated in a pressurized tank, and so it's a little bit artificial. This is a very commercial, industrial form of making sparkling wine and is usually used to make bulk quantities of sparkling wine. It's cheaper, faster, and requires very little art or skill compared to other methods, producing a lower quality wine. When many people think of sparkling wines, the initial thought is usually champagne. This is because champagne is the highest quality of sparkling wine that there is. It uses the traditional method and sets the tone for elegance and prestige in sparkling wines. Champagne is made with 3 types of grapes: Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. The Pinot Noir is used for body. The next grape stands for the vibrance in the champagne. And lastly, the Chardonnay gives the champagne a good backbone. Most all champagne is a blend of these 3 grapes. So champagne is produced and made in a region of France called Champagne. This is actually a place in Champagne that's very northern. Other people in other places can use the same method, even people in other areas of France. But if it is not produced in the region of Champagne, it cannot be bottled as champagne and labeled as champagne. So because Champagne is a very northern region of France, this means that this affects the acidity of champagne. Because it's one of the most northern regions, sparkling wines are produced, except for Moselle, Germany, which is also a very northern region. The climate affects the acidity of sparkling wine. It's essential for a high-quality sparkling wine because the sparkling wine should have the effect of cleansing and the palate and to be refreshing. So acidity is important. Again, the aging time for champagne is very interesting. It's aged to at a minimum of 15 months for a non-vintage champagne, and for a vintage champagne, it is aged up to 3 years. There are some very interesting combinations of grapes used to make sparkling wines that I think is worth delving into. These are especially significant when we talk about champagne, and these are very common when we talk about champagne. First, there's Blanc de Blanc. Blanc de Blanc is made with only white grapes, usually Chardonnay grapes. So this is usually maybe a little bit sweeter, and it gives acidity and complexity to the wine. Also, it is common with champagne to use Blanc de Blanc or Blanc de Noir. A Blanc de Noir produces a white sparkling wine that is made with only red grapes. So red grapes traditionally make a red wine, but the color of the wines comes from the skin of the grapes. So they can use a method of using the insides of the grapes, usually a Pinot Noir red grape, to make a white-colored sparkling wine. As you can see in the photo on the slide, it is a Pinot Noir, but the liquid in the glass is clear and white. When we use a Blanc de Noir, it has more body and complexity, which makes it a great pairing for a main course. Another type of a mix of grapes being used is a sparkler. So a sparkler is usually white or rosé wine. Rosé can pair well with stronger dishes like pâté or wild game. So this is another great choice of something that might have a bit of a pink hue to it. Effervescence is the most distinguished characteristic of sparkling wine, so it's essential that we talk about it and learn a little bit more about it. effervescence has a cleansing and refreshing effect. So it lessens the bitterness of food, so a more effervescent wine will pair better with a more bitter food. It is a great palate cleanser, especially for a food that's more fatty, salty, or bitter. So perhaps there is a salty appetizer or a fatty meat. Effervescence will come in handy there to cleanse the palate. How we judge effervescence is based off of a few distinguished characteristics. The characteristics that stand out the most when judging the effervescence of a sparkling wine are the amount of bubbles, the bubble size, the consistency, and how long the bubbles last. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about dosage, which is added towards the end of the second fermentation process when creating sparkling wine. Dosage highly impacts the sweetness of the sparkling wine. There is a vast levels of sweetness in wines, from dry to very sweet. So let's kind of go through them and talk about the different dry and sweet levels. The driest of the sparkling wines is called a brut. So the brut tastes dry. The next step is extra dry. So the extra dry will taste slightly sweet, but still have more of a dry taste to it and mouthfeel. The next one is called sec, and sec is a noticeably sweet sparkling wine. Next is demi-sec, and demi-sec is definitely sweet, so you can definitely taste a noticeable sweetness in the mouth. Last but not least is the dough wine. So the dough wine is extremely sweet, and this one has a lot of residual sugar. You might also see some residual sugar with demi-sec, but you will most definitely see residual sugar with a dough wine. So matching the sweetness in the wine with the food is very important. With sweetness, we want the pairings to be similar in order to have the best pairing. So something that is very sweet will need an even sweeter sparkling wine. Something that isn't very sweet but might have a little bit of sweetness will still need kind of a sweet wine. The sparkling wine should usually be at least as sweet as the food that it is pairing with. So some interesting tips for pairing are that a brut and extra dry pair very well with seafood, poultry, Asian flavors, and appetizers. The reason we say appetizers is because a lot of the times these kind of get the palate going. They might have a little bit more carbs or some interesting flavors. Appetizers usually aren't sweet. Also, the Asian flavors have some spiciness to it, and so pairing something that's a little bit more dry pairs very well. Also, when we talk about sec and demi-sec and dough wines, they pair especially well with desserts and fruit because these are the extra sweet sparkling wines, and so you need something sweet to pair with them. Now that we've delved into some of the many methods and intricate characteristics of sparkling wine and even gotten into a little bit of the pairings, let's talk about how we serve sparkling wine. Sparkling wine is best served chilled, and even red sparkling wines are best served chilled. Traditionally, when we have a flat red wine, we don't want it to be cold, but with the sparkling wines of all colors and varieties, we want them to be chilled. Because of the bubbles in a sparkling wine, they will go flat within a few hours. The only thing we can really do to help and prevent this if we don't finish a bottle is to buy what's called a champagne stopper, which can be seen in this photo in the refrigerator. If once we're halfway through a bottle of champagne, we want to stop drinking it and try and save it, we can put the champagne stopper on there and immediately refrigerate it. This will slow down the continuing flatness of the champagne or any other sparkling wine, and it'll stay good for 1 to 2 days after. In addition to class lecture, I also used 3 other websites to learn more about sparkling wine and how it's made.